Louis Touton, Icann's first employee and also its first general counsel. Louis, how did you get into the DNS world?
I got into the DNS world through Icann. That was my goal. It wasn't to get into the DNS.
So you weren't there before?
No, not at all. I was, in 1998, I was a lawyer at the Jones Day law firm, and we got a solicitation from John Postel of several law firms asking for our qualifications to go through what we later found was the white paper process of setting up what became Icann. And we met those qualifications. For example, having an office in Washington. That was important because the U.S. government was transferring responsibility to Icann. We also had antitrust experience because there was fear that there would be antitrust claims from the then incumbent Network Solutions, who was operating the DNS. So we put together a team, including me, to work on how to form this entity basically from nothing.
Louis, was this a pro bono situation?
Absolutely. We agreed to take it through the inception. It ended up being much more costly than we imagined to us, but that's sort of what you take.
Now, I realize Jones Day was much smaller than the behemoth it is today in terms of law firms, but why on earth would you want to do this work for this sort of obscure organization, the likes of which had never been seen before, on a pro bono basis?
I think it was intriguing to many of us, including to Joe Sims, who was the lead on that team. Something that was very different than anything we'd ever done before.
What is what is the impression that you had from the time that you spent with Icann? What sticks in your mind more than anything else?
Today, I was at Icann until the middle of 2003, so 3.5 years, I guess. And what sticks in my mind is it really was a novel thing. No one had really tried to do it, do something like this in this way. You had models of the IETF and others who had similar kinds of ideas, but a much closer community of interest. IETF was a bunch of engineers. This was engineers, lawyers, civil society, all these groups that became what we now call the multi-stakeholder model.
How did you come to be the first employee?
Well, I was originally working as part of the pro bono effort as a Jones Day lawyer. And then I was up visiting Mike Roberts, who had his home near Palo Alto. And I decided, I'd kind of like to shake up my life a bit. And let's see if I can just do it. Because, by that time, John Postel had died. That took a lot of the wind out of the sails of the effort, if you will.
And it was a sudden death, so I imagine that was even more jarring.
Absolutely. John was the one who was supposed to take this through to the finish line. And unfortunately, he was taken from us near the starting line. Anyway, I decided that maybe I could help. The organization didn't have any money to speak of, had some donations. And had to keep going back to donors for more donations. Had no funding mechanism. In the white paper, that had not been worked out. And so it was living off of the CEO, who was Mike Roberts at the time, living off of his credit card mainly, and a lot of generosity from USC and others who contributed things sort of for payment later.
So very much a hand-to-mouth existence
in
those early days.
Absolutely. There was no money, and so there was no point. I wanted to do this. It was an interesting project, and I didn't see it as a prospect for getting paid, actually.
Yeah. Now, you didn't get paid, in fact, right?
I didn't get paid my whole time.
For what period of time?
For 3.5 years.
And it's amazing to me. So you got no pay for 3.5 years, and you were involved in this thing simply because of its uniqueness.
That's right. And I didn't plan on it lasting 3.5 years. I'd had experiences in my life before, and I made a 2-year commitment. That 2-year commitments usually stretch into about 3 or 4 years. So that's the same was true here.
What were the legal challenges you were facing and that you were dealing with in that early period?
Well, when John died, as I mentioned, it took wind out of the sails of the organization in lots of ways. So what we tried to do is to recapture what we could of his goodwill and put it in to propel the organization. He had a lot of goodwill in the community. I mean, like anybody, he had people who had differing views than him. But he, had he lived, would have taken it through to, I'm sure, a much easier beginning. We didn't have John. We were deprived of us of legitimacy in many people's eyes. But also there was loyalty to John, that it was his vision to have this organization in a multi-stakeholder model, and that we could carry it through.
In your mind, at that time, did you ever have a moment where you thought, this thing's not going to work, it's not going to fly?
Yes. Most of my time was dedicated to just working on the day-to-day material. And although I had been a lawyer, I probably spent about 1/3 of my time doing legal tasks here, and the rest doing everything else. I remember staying many nights and answering all of the Ican's mail every night. I learned how to be a webmaster. I did a lot of things like that in addition to hiring people. But in any event, by late in 2001, essentially, it started to look to me like maybe this wouldn't work. There was just not a lot of cohesiveness in the community. We had done pretty well with the IETF in terms of cementing a relationship with them, but we also had to cement relationships with the RIRs, which was sort of moderately difficult, and with the country code operators, which was very difficult. So parts of the overall mission of Icann seemed to be spinning out of our control.
Now, this feeling you had that it might not work, was that a minority feeling, or did others feel the same way you did?
Well, by that time, Stuart Lynn had become our CEO, and he definitely had the same view that everywhere you looked, there was something non-functional, and we needed to find a way to help the community repair that and find ways to follow this novel but very general idea of multi-stakeholderism.
Stuart Lynn told us 1 year after he became CEO that the sort of open letter that he had done to the internet community, where he basically said pretty much what you just said, this may not work, was fairly negative in his perceptions of the future. And I asked him about that, and he said, well, part of that was to poke a little bit, to provoke active dialogue and to get the community moving. Was it effective?
Ultimately, it was. It allowed the initial reorganization, what we then called Icann 2.0. And I know there's been adjustments since then as well, but that was very much, I think, a needed change at the time. And not so much just in the different structures or ways of dealing, but getting people to understand that this was really in peril, and they couldn't just have a my way or the highway attitude and make this idea work. There needed to be more compromise.
Was there a perception that there was another model, there was another alternative, something waiting in the wings that would take the place of Icann?
There were lots of discussions of other things that ought to be done, but everybody had a different idea. So, Icann was the horse that was there to ride, and I think it needed to ride wherever the community took it.
What, if any, role did you play in forming the UDRP?
Actually, before I came to Icann as an employee, I worked on that, meeting with members of the community and including Network Solutions, which had its own ideas as to how it ought to be reformed. We needed to get, according to the white paper, we basically needed to get the UDRP in place, before we could introduce competition at the registrar level, the so-called test bed, where we selected 5 registrars from many applicants to share with Network Solutions registrar the doings of the registrars, and then the creation of a separate layer for the registry for ComNet and org back then.
Louis, was there a point where you thought, and maybe there wasn't, maybe you did your 3 years and you were uncertain, but did you reach a point during your tenure where you thought, okay, we're over the hump, we're going to make it?
About the time I left, and that was shortly after Stewart retired and Paul Toomey came on, by then I decided that I was also going to move on. And it was in part because we were to a stage where some of the initial issues had been cured, but we were also, I also felt that having the original team there anymore was probably not helpful to the continuing.
There needed to be some new blood?
Right. The initial team, and that was included me and Mike Roberts, and then following with Stewart, and also the initial board, and Andrew McLaughlin, who was also working here with me. The initial team was very much, I think, of a mind that they were a transition from nothing to something that would be launched and go on its own, and that the community really needed to have its own organization and to run its own organization and feed into the organization.
How would you describe Icann's relationship with the U.S. government at that time?
Well, obviously, the U.S. government back in November of 1998 or so had endorsed Icann, or endorsed the Postel proposal as what would become Icann. On the other hand, there was a lot of tension, and one of the sources of the tension is that the initial view from the white paper was that this could be accomplished in no more than 18 months. It took over 18 years to finally get the U.S. government to step back completely. Now, there were stages where they stepped back in little steps, but it wasn't until a year ago or so that they stepped away.
And no one back then thought it would take that long. No one dreamed it would take that long.
Oh, and when we found out that the plans were changing, we understood in part that it was more challenging than originally contemplated. But it seemed like, whoa, this isn't what we thought where we were headed. We thought, we were going to set it up and it would then be launched.
Through the years, Icann has been called to testify before various congressional committees. You testified, correct?
I did once, yes.
Tell me about it.
Well, I'd been to a couple of prior Icann hearings on the Hill, but I got to say it's quite an experience, and you're just a punching bag when you're testifying before Congress.
Is that what it turned into?
In a soft way, yes. I was in front of an intellectual property kind of hearing, so it was a little less difficult than some of them. But I can remember Mike Roberts and others being on very hot seats before Congress.
What was the greatest challenge that you personally faced during your tenure with Icann?
Well, first of all, it was very grueling. It required a high level of dedication, if you will. In the 3.5 years, I worked every day except one, including weekends and holidays. There was always a lot to do. We didn't have enough people to do it because we didn't have the money to hire people initially. When we got the funding mechanism going, which was about a year after I arrived at Icann, we started to be able to hire people. But even then, when I left, there were, I think, 27 employees. And that was an interesting progression because at one time I had been doing every one of their jobs. And as the work grew on each segment, we would hire someone. Dan Halloran came, for example, to handle the registrars. He was a great help. But we not only could get the work done, but we could also give people the attention that they deserved, which often I was not able to do because it was so concentrated on me.
As I hear you talk, and maybe it's completely wrong, I almost feel a sense of pride that you helped get this thing going.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I don't for a moment regret that I spent those 3.5 years of my life doing that. I mean, it was unique.
Is it like any other endeavor that you'd undertaken?
Absolutely not. I mean, it was a completely new experience that I didn't even know how to do when I really walked in here. I had the white paper as the plan, and every month Mike Roberts, who was living out of town, and would come down and meet with me, and Andrew would come in, and he'd go through the white paper and said, okay, there's these, 14 tasks or something he had identified that we needed to do. Here's what we're going to do this month. And we'd start on those things. And we knocked them off just one by one. Mike was very organized and methodical about it.
Sounds like you're saying challenging but fun.
Yes, absolutely. It was. I wouldn't give it up for a moment. And it required, I think, as I mentioned before, that I step back at the end of my tenure to let the community fly on its own wings. So I don't have a lot of continuing relationships with people, but it was a lot of fun knowing them.
Louis Touton, Icann's first general counsel and first employee, thank you again for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you very much. It's been a delight.